We had invited all of you in the Proclaim community to send in questions, and that was one of them. And then what we decided for this third round was that we'd have each person answer a different question. So Phyllis, we were going to start with you. And your question was, how do you feel the Spirit working through you, pushing you, sustaining you, and guiding you into the founding of LLGM and ECP? What was one of those Spirit moments that occurred in the early days?
I'm going to choose a story it was early summer of 1993, and I was about 5 months pregnant. It was a very busy time, hectic schedule, and we just needed a break. So we went to Minnesota, where Ruth's family has a cabin up in northern Minnesota. We were out canoeing on the lake, and we kind of went near what was called Preacher's Point, all these retired Lutheran clergy, seminary professors. It was like, okay, so there we were. And one of them was out on the deck, and he said, come over here. And we're like, oh, God, really? Oh. And so we come over, and then he recognizes us. We recognize him. And it's Morris Wee Sr., who was a very prominent person in that realm. And so he was asking about our ministry. He recognized us, knew what was going on. And so we're telling him. And it's this beautiful, getting to be sunset. We're on this beautiful, beautiful lake. And we're in the canoe. He's on the dock. We're talking. And eventually we said, well, we were pregnant and we were expecting this baby and all these just concerns and, just the hopes and dreams. And he said, well, come closer. No, closer. So we're paddle up closer. So we're sitting out there. And he is kind of a tall guy. And I tell you, it was amazing. He reached out his arms and he just, in this resonant voice over the lake, did this blessing. And it was, I wish I could have memorize it or record it. The words were beautiful. It was poetic. It was concise. It was so powerful. He blessed our ministry, our lives, our union, our family, our child. And he just did this incredible, it was like for love and peace and joy. And it was like, then the sun went down. It was like liquid gold. So it sustained us for the work. And it just gave us that incredible sense of knowing we were blessed. He died 2 years later. And this summer, I will officiate at his granddaughter's wedding. And the two women will honeymoon at the lake and sit on that dock and know they are blessed.
Our next question is for Margaret Moreland. And as she gets prepared, Margaret, we're going to be asking you to share with us how this movement has, and the people you've met, have changed you.
I attended the 1990 ordinations of Jeff and Ruth and Phyllis, and during that service, there were prayers said by the people in the congregation, which really affected me. People said things like, I haven't been in church in so many years, and this is so wonderful. Thank you, God. My gay son left the church because he felt unwelcome. Now he may be able to come back. This made me realize that the ELCA policy was truly damaging to many people. I felt I couldn't stay part of a church unless I did something to make a difference. When I was invited to be part of starting an alternative candidacy process, I felt pulled in and was excited, but I wasn't sure what a chemist could do. I had been involved with other justice causes, but was never grabbed by one like I was with this. I'm an introvert, and talking to people I don't know is always difficult for me. I soon realized, though, that I love talking about ECP and LLGM, and I still love talking about ELM. I'm still very much an introvert, and I'm not likely to talk about many other things. This work also reinforced for me the importance of remembering that I personally am not affected by the church's policy, so I have to listen very carefully to those of you who are. It's easy for people with privilege, when working for justice for others, to try to be in control or to direct what should be done. But it's important for those who are affected by the injustice to be the ones who lead. But I do have the ability to talk to and even badger other straight people about this work. The people that I've met and worked with have changed my relationship with God by showing me how God appears in and through them. I always kind of felt that God was something that was separate from people, but I began to see that God is also present within the people who applied for ECP rostering, and that God might even be present in me.
Okay, we're going next to Greg. And Greg, what we'd like to hear from you is each of us has our own unique personality. I'll give you this mic, actually. Each of us has our own unique personality. How have you maintained your integrity to yourself along the way? Has it changed over the years?
Thank you, Anderson. We actually agreed none of us would say that, but I couldn't resist. For me, integrity means being true to myself and having a clear sense of what's most important. And when we started this work, I just really, really, truly believed that we had a moral responsibility to work for policy change and that we were acting in defense of the gospel. Especially at that time with everything that was happening in San Francisco, I was just ashamed for our church. As we often said, and I truly believed, the policy at the time, and still is in some places, it was cruel, it destroyed faith, and it drove people away from Christ. So we had to work for that change. In terms of how things changed over time, and I got a sense from this question about personality that somebody might have been asking about where they might fit in the movement. Anyway, going with that. Over time, I developed a clear awareness of my own gifts and limitations. Of course, at times, this work required all of us to step outside or maybe be pushed out of our comfort zones, and you have to be willing to go there. But in personality, I'm much more like Martha than Mary. I am much more comfortable doing behind-the-scenes work. So I embraced the work of the movement that fit my personality and vocation, and that was more like organization development, administration, and sometimes diplomacy. Both within the organization and certainly in our external work. And then lastly, I always tried to be honest and just to do my best. As you know, this kind of work is never done. It's hard to know when to go to sleep at night, right? There's always more to do. And so at the end of the day, you have to be able to let go, and you have to be able to leave something for tomorrow or maybe pass the baton to the next runner. For me, integrity means that somebody would come up to us and say, well done, good and faithful servants.
Jeff Johnson, if you could go back and visit and describe to yourself, your 1990 self, how the ELCA looks today, what would you be most excited to learn?
There are a couple of things that I wouldn't be excited to learn, right? I wouldn't be excited to learn that we're still a mostly white church, right? I wouldn't be excited to learn that we're still more preoccupied with sex and marriage and celibacy than we are with something like global climate change. I wouldn't be excited to learn that VNE, which was written around a specific situation, still exists, that it is bigger than it ever has been. These things I wouldn't be excited about. I would be excited to say that, it's not hard to call the secretary of the ELCA and change the name information for my husband. I get no pushback around that. That's kind of exciting, something that I really couldn't have imagined in 1990. I am excited I would be excited to say that HIV, while it still is a disease, you can live with it in a way that Joel Workin couldn't, and in the way that so many people couldn't in 1990. And I would be excited to say that that the experiment of one church instead of these three predecessor churches, the experiment is working, but the bloat that we experienced early on, where you had 3 bureaucracies that merged and suddenly you had a huge Chicago-based organization. The bloat is going away, and the church is right-sizing, and we're becoming smaller and more appropriate in our context, in our settings. That's not a bad thing. It's a really good thing, and it allows us to bear stronger witness to the gospel.
Next, we're going to Ruth. And Ruth, our question for you is, how do you think LGBTQ people transform our church?
I can't possibly give you a talk about that, so I'm going to share a story with you, a true story that came from my ministry. First, a quote from Leonard Cohen. "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." This is a story of a child named Teresa Rose. Her family included her mother and father and 2 brothers and a sister. As a child, Teresa Rose knew she was different, but not by how much. She found herself at odds with her life as it had been defined for her at birth and by her family and her Roman Catholic Church. In late adolescence, struggling to define herself and knowing she was attracted to girls, Teresa Rose came out as lesbian. Her courage to declare herself inspired her older brother to come out as gay and claim his identity. The 2 became allies. Teresa Rose's family had to reconfigure around this new self-understanding of 2 of their family members. Though Teresa Rose enjoyed being able to date and have girlfriends, she still had a growing awareness that assuming a lesbian identity didn't quite cover her own sense of self. Now a young adult, Teresa Rose persisted in self-formation, realizing that she was not lesbian, but that he was transgender, and he needed a new name. This coming out jostled the family into yet another configuration. In the process of witnessing his child's emergent self-identity and the struggle it took to claim it, Teresa Rose's father realized he could no longer hold his own secrets, and he came out as gay to his wife and children. Time passed. Teresa Rose began hormone treatment in preparation for gender reassignment surgery. Choosing a new name became urgent. Teresa Rose's sister suggested that perhaps Joshua would be a good new name, because aren't you about knocking down walls in this family? So Teresa Rose became Joshua. In one of our family counseling sessions, Joshua's mother said to me, "Pastor Ruth, all I wanted was an ordinary family." And I replied, "You don't get ordinary, you get extraordinary." And they were, because through all their family reconfigurations, the one certainty this family maintained was their love for one another. While Joshua rejoiced in his family's willingness to take this journey with him, he realized he needed something else in preparation for the surgery that would reintegrate him with his emergent identity. He needed to know that God understood him. He needed to know that his baptism held. He needed to know that God approved of him. Do I need to be rebaptized as well as renamed? He wondered. I assured him he did not. I suggested combining a ritual of thanksgiving for new beginnings with an affirmation of baptism under his new name. And so our preparations began. Joshua came from a very musical family who had sung together under the direction of their father, a choir director. The family decided to sing Joshua into a new song to celebrate his reunion with himself and with them as a trans man. They chose a call and response song whose theme was God calling Joshua out of the wilderness and leading him into a new land as one who was tearing down walls with the power of his song. Joshua worried that his voice would crack because of his hormone treatments, and he might slide between his old soprano voice and his new tenor voice. His family assured him his voice would carry. Joshua's sister made the altar cloth, which had 6 trumpets sewn into it, representing each member of their family. The day of the ritual, friends, family, co-workers, and congregants packed the church. Just before the service started, Josh's mother ran up to me, excitedly waving a box that contained the candle presented in baptism 30 years earlier to Teresa Rose. Pulling it out of the box, she exclaimed, "Look, it was never lit. Today, we will light it for the first time for Joshua. God has always known this day would come." And light it we did. The trumpet sounded, and Josh's family choir called him out of the wilderness. He responded with a voice that did crack, but carried clearly over all the others. That day, God called a son and his family out of the wilderness, but many more people came out with them. The whole congregation was given a new song to sing, and there was much rejoicing. Together, we all looked at God's creation, and behold, we saw that it was very good. Sitting with Josh's co-workers gathered in the fellowship hall for cake and coffee afterwards, I found myself talking to Josh's boss. Leaning in confidentially, he said, "You know, I never really understood any of this when Josh came out at work as transgender. And when he invited me to come to this, I really didn't want to. But I didn't want him to have a hard time at the office, so I thought I should set a good example. But now, I get it. I will never forget this service. I'm going back to the firm and mandating that we all get ourselves educated about how to have a hospitable office culture in which transgendered people can feel welcome and safe." That day, Josh came home and a family was made whole. And that is how LGBTQ people are transforming this church.
This next question might allow us to get things really interesting. And we're turning to Jim DeLange to tell us about your relationships with each other. How you pushed, supported, prayed for, irritated, and generated from one another.
My. I was one of the 1,000 or so pastors who left the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod back in the 1970s, when that church body took a sharp turn to the right. That made me realize that the church, like all large institutions, is a human organization, a political entity, if you will. And political strategies must be brought to bring about change. From the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I learned from Martin Luther King and from President Lyndon Johnson that the art of politics is how you get things done. Most pastors would never identify themselves as politicians, but I had no problem with identifying myself as a church politician. So I recognized early on that the changes in ELCA policy might take a long time. I was pleasantly surprised when it happened in 2009. I never thought it would happen in my lifetime, that the ELCA would make the change before the Presbyterians and the Methodists. The second question I wanted to respond to was that how have you been changed by this movement and the people it brought into your life? Let me get a little drink here. At every step of the journey, I have been impressed by the patience, resiliency, and devotion of LGBT people who wanted to be honest about who they were and wanted to serve as pastors in the church. Putting myself in their shoes, I would long ago have given up. It just wouldn't be worth the effort. For that reason, I think that LGBT pastors make better pastors. Straight folks like me have never had to struggle like that. It has reinforced my belief that there just might be something to this Christianity thing.
And finally, we're going to turn to Mari Irvin to ask, what do you think is important for an LGBTQ seminarian or rostered leader just coming into the movement to know about our history?
Well, first of all, I'd like to assure that each one of you here is a part of somebody else's history, somebody who's coming after you, perhaps generations after you. But this is a continuing process. Just as LGM and ECP were the continuing process of work that had begun in the Lutheran Church years before. The difference was that there was something that happened that triggered the necessity for a response. And there were people there who chose to respond to it in a positive way, although it was hard to think of it as a positive thing. I'm reminded of a metaphor that served me very well at a very difficult time in my life. When I was trying to figure out what I was really going to do next, I simply didn't know. I had responsibilities, I had concerns, I was struggling to come out as a lesbian, I had 2 sons, I had a husband. It was a very, very difficult time, and I started journaling a lot. And one night, before I started journaling, I read something in some book, and I have no idea where it is, perhaps one of you knows it. It talked about the fact that if you are walking on a very dangerous path, on a cliff, where you might fall off at any minute, you don't have to worry about anything but your very next step. And if you have a flashlight, or a match, or something that will illuminate the path for you, although that path might be just one step, that'll do the job. So I think it's really important for you to know that we all began this part of the movement, which had begun before us, by taking steps. And some of them were steps we had no light, and the path was a bit rocky. But we took steps, we helped each other along, and if you can pass that message on to those who come to you, who want to know what it means to be a part of this particular movement, assure them that not only will their own lives change dramatically, but they will be part of somebody's history who will come long after them.